So welcome to our monthly webinar on utilization-focused evaluation. I'm Charmaine Campbell-Patton, and I'm joined by Michael Quinn-Patton. I believe needs no introduction, but he will be talking to you shortly. And we are coming to you from Dakota land and Anishinaabe territory in Minnesota. And I am just about a mile west of the Mississippi River. And Michael is a few steps from the Snake River. And today we just want to acknowledge that Dakota and Anishinaabe people have been calling this land home and taking care of it for many, many years before any white settlers came. And we are settlers on this land, and we recognize the history and legacy of attempted genocide, enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans, and know that we have a responsibility to undo the harms that have happened and continue to happen. And so as part of our land acknowledgement, we are also making a commitment to redistribute the royalties from this utilization-focused evaluation 5th edition book to a couple of organizations that are working. One is a local organization, Dahota UFE, that is working on Dakota language revitalization. And I encourage you to connect with the communities where you are from and think about how you can support them to work on revitalizing language, because that's such a key part of this work. And then also Indigenous Environmental Network, which is a global organization working on equity and sustainability issues. So wanted to start with that. This is a photograph of the beautiful dandelions a few blocks from my house. We just had a full moon here, and that is known by many as the flower moon here in the Northern Hemisphere, because the flowers are out and blooming all around us here in Minnesota. We have dandelions and blossoms, crabapple blossoms, lilacs. So I wanted to give you a flavor of that. Hopefully there's some beauty where you are as well. And as we begin, for those of you who've joined us for many of these webinars, this will be slight review for you, but we just want to start from the beginning of our principles-focused, utilization-focused evaluation model, which is our overarching principle of utilization-focused evaluation, which is to focus on use by and with intended users in every aspect of and at every stage of an evaluation. So that is the overarching principle that guides everything that we do with utilization-focused evaluation. And with these webinars, we're walking you through some of the operating principles that support reaching that overarching principle. We've talked already about the first two, contextualize and personalize. And so today we are going to be digging into the third operating principle, which is to customize, to be purpose-driven and engage with primary intended users to determine the evaluation's distinctive uses. And so we're going to talk through what that looks like. And I'm going to pass it over to Michael to get us started. Anything you want to say to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today?
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Charmaine. The importance of identifying the purpose of the evaluation out of the situation analysis and working with the primary intended users is a critical principle. And we're going to look at some of the challenges of that and the choices among purpose that we're often facing as we do this. So, and we'll be inviting your questions and comments as you go along. Feel free to enter things into chat, and we'll share some additional resources as we go along.
So just to put this in context, we've talked about principle 1 to contextualize through a situation analysis and principle 2 to personalize for primary intended users. these are really the foundations and are feeding into this third principle to customize. So when we talk about contextualizing, we're talking about not only the local context, the program context, whatever sort of situation the evaluation is being, smaller situation the evaluation is being run in, but also the bigger picture, thinking about the climate emergency and equity and social justice issues. And so that is how we weave in. We want utilization-focused evaluation to really uphold this commitment to evaluation serving purposes of equity and sustainability as well, so that we wrap into this customize. And then the personalized principle we talked about last month really is that you can't customize it unless you know who you're customizing it for. And so you have to start there. And the primary user is who you're going to be working with to customize this evaluation based on that situation. And there are 6 purposes that we're going to talk about today that will frame the customization that you'll be doing. The first is judging overall merit, worth, and significance. The second purpose is learning and improvement. The third is determining whether a program is operating in accordance with external expectations and mandates. The fourth is monitoring for internal management and oversight. The fifth is generating knowledge and lessons. And the sixth is supporting innovation and adaptation. We recognize there are many other purposes, and we'll talk about that at the end, but these are the 6 that we're going to focus on when we talk about how to customize a utilization-focused evaluation. And this is, these are some questions that can guide how to get at that. Michael, do you want to talk at all about these? I don't know if we need to read through every single one of them, but this is about how to connect the use to decision-making.
Right, and the overall thrust of these questions that come from the book and this chapter is to go deep into use with the purpose of it, so that it's not just sort of blasé. People say, oh, what's your purpose of the evaluation? They say, well, accountability and learning. You want to dig deeper into that. Accountability to whom, for what? And we'll go through some of that. Learning about what, for whom, what would you do with it? And what decisions are there lingering out there? When do those have to get made? Who's going to make them? So it's pushing deep into use. One of the common mistakes that we address throughout the book and throughout utilization-focused evaluation is the notion that you worry about these things at the end of the evaluation. But in fact, the overall principle of attending to use from the beginning is that unless you've designed the evaluation with intended use in mind, both who it's for and what kind of evaluation is going on, then you won't have the appropriate information to meet those needs at the end. And so this is about really going deeply into how people really intend to use the information, when, by whom, for what purposes, and to get quite concrete about it. In the same way that last time we made the point that when we're dealing with intended users, it's not just saying it's for the organization or it's for Congress or it's for an agency or it's for the foundation, but to be quite specific about who it's for. Intended use is being quite specific about what you would do with the information. So the summative evaluation, one of our early classic distinctions from Michael Scriven, is really making judgments in order to inform the future of a program. It asks whether the program worked, if it attained its goals, whether it was good value for money, whether the results can be attributed to the program. There's a focus on outcomes and attribution. And summative evaluations are especially supported by the credibility of the evaluator as having rendered neutral and independent judgment, by the credibility and rigor of the design, the significance of the findings to decision makers, and the timeliness, which is especially important, so that it's aimed at making judgments about should the program be continued, should it be expanded and taken to scale, should it be reduced. These are big picture decisions, top of the mountain decisions, summing up kinds of decisions. And an example of that comes from the Packard Foundation had a major national model working with children, families, and communities on a family visitation program. And they conducted a major summative evaluation, both quantitative and qualitative data, with a comparative design to judge whether or not that model worked. Summative evaluation is typically about models. So it's not just a particular program, but it tends to be that aspect of evaluation that is seeking for models that can be taken to scale, that can be disseminated. And so when the issue is about whether the demonstrating the meaningfulness of the program for other settings, what that would mean, what the model is, that's where summative evaluation becomes particularly important.
And so often contrasted with summative evaluation is formative evaluation, which is really about learning and improvement, focus on learning and improvement. And so the types of questions that we ask in formative evaluation are, what are the program strengths and weaknesses? To what extent are participants progressing towards the outcomes? What types of participants are progressing and which ones aren't doing so well and why? And what implementation problems have emerged? And so this is really about feedback about what is working well, but ultimately the goal of that feedback in formative evaluation really is to arrive at a model, as Michael said, that then would be summatively evaluated. So that tends to be the distinction. And in this instance, the things that really support use are a learning culture in an organization and a program, a desire to improve and get better, and openness to feedback, trust of one another and trust in the data, and a skilled evaluator that can facilitate learning from the data, as well as making sure that the findings are relevant to the program and to what's actually happening and what decisions are being made, and the ability to act on the findings that were produced. So formative evaluation, again, is really about learning and improvement, and is often in the early days of a program or an initiative to help them reach that model. And so one of the examples that I use is an organization, World Savvy, that I worked with for a long time. They're celebrating their 20th anniversary now, but in their early days, back in 2002 to 5, they were implementing a program for youth, middle and high school youth, and interested in learning about global issues. And so they were really trying to understand, is this program having an impact on children and youth? But they were in the early days of figuring out what was working and what wasn't working. And so we were doing surveys of teachers and students to understand, to what extent the program was having progressing students towards global competence, and trying to understand how to define that. So it was really formative. We were trying to learn and improve. And at the time, there was thinking that we would get to a model that would be replicated and scaled across the country. And that isn't exactly what happened. And I'll turn back to them later in our webinar to circle back. But in the early days of their work, formative evaluation really was the focus of that improvement and learning process.
So what we want to do now is turn from the conceptual to the practical. The morphing of summative and formative into midterm and into project evaluations, and the boilerplate commissioning of evaluations to do midterm evaluation for formative improvement purposes and in the project for summative purposes is, as near as I can tell, the most common framing of evaluation in international agencies, among foundations and government programs, and programs of all kinds. It's become sort of standard practice. And unfortunately, that is relatively thoughtless about when and how an evaluation would actually get used. I wanted to use the Caribbean Ag Extension Program, which I worked with for 10 years, in the agricultural extension system within the Caribbean on a big USAID project. The several UN agencies supported it. The Caribbean Agricultural Extension Program was also supported by the agencies within the Caribbean, involved 10 different countries. The project was designed to run from 1980 to 1990 in 3 phases. And I was involved in the first phase, which was the planning of the needs assessment and designing the program improvement interventions. So when we arrived in January of 1980, and I began asking the funders when they would have to make the decision about phase 2, which is a summative evaluation. Would the program be continued? And what I found was that the agriculture program in the Caribbean would have to be designed by USAID to go to the State Department budget in Congress, and that while the phase 1 was going to run from January of 1980 through December of 1982, the decision about whether there would be a phase 2 would be taken in September of 1980, 9 months after we began, and before we had actually done any real work. We were still building relationships, getting everybody on the same page, beginning to engage with people about what we were going to do. And yet the summative decision, will the program move from phase 1 to phase 2, was going to happen 9 months into it. And the importance of that lesson for me, this is the time I was just writing utilization-focused evaluation in the first edition, was to be sure that when we're talking about either formative or summative, that they're tied to real timelines. So for example, it's virtually always worthless from a use point of view to have the summative evaluation deadline for submission of findings at the end of a project or program, because all decisions about its continuation are going to be taken well ahead of that. So if you're doing a summative evaluation, don't automatically fall into the trap, which commissioners and contracts do, of making the report and findings due at the end of the program or project period. The question you want to ask is, when will that decision be taken? And then you have to back up from there to figure out when you could produce findings with enough time to discuss them and have an impact on that decision. In the case of the Caribbean project, what we ended up doing, since we couldn't really do a summative evaluation per se, since there weren't activities to evaluate, but the needs assessment was 3 years old. So we updated the needs assessment and had to get that done in the first 6 months of the program, which did lead to continuation into phase 2. But we had a boilerplate contract for evaluation that called for a midterm evaluation halfway through, which would have been too late to even inform the summative decision, and then an end of project evaluation. There was then an end of phase 1 evaluation that was formative for phase 2. So in this case, the usual midterm, end of project, formative, summative distinctions are turned around. We did the summative in the first 6 months of the program to inform a judgment about going to phase 2. And then the formative for phase 2 took place at the end of the program with our external evaluation team. Likewise, then, for formative evaluation, it's a big mistake to simply go by the typical boilerplate that you do this halfway through. When you're doing formative evaluation, you want to be asking, when do people in the program meet to look backwards, to look forwards, to think about what they're doing? What's the work plan schedule? What's the budgeting schedule? What's the planning schedule? And to have evaluation connected to that. A major reason why evaluations don't get used is that they're not connected to the processes that people are going through in their programs. And so one of the things I often look for is if a program has an annual retreat. Most programs, staff get together at some point and have an annual retreat where they're looking back, they're looking forward, extracting lessons. If you're doing formative evaluation, you want to have your results ready for that retreat. So imagine that halfway through the program on the midterm evaluation would take place in August, but the annual retreat of the program is in July. Your results in August are going to be meaningless if people are doing their formative reflection in July. Once you find out the retreat is in July, you then have to work backwards. When are materials due for the retreat? Who's controlling the retreat? How do you get on the agenda for the retreat? And the final piece of practical wisdom about that is that when you discuss with people doing the retreat where you would participate in the retreat, they will almost automatically put you at the end, because when they hear the evaluation word, they say, oh, that goes at the end. When in fact, what you want to discuss with them is being at the beginning of the retreat so that your findings can help frame the discussions of the retreat. These are simply the practical ways in which utilization-focused evaluation gets beyond the one-size-fits-all midterm into project. What customizing means, what the customizing principle means, is figure out when the action is, when the decisions is, when the reflections are, and time your work to feed into those processes.
So that was summative and formative, sort of the two that we hear most often about in the evaluation world, or at least traditionally. I think that's starting to change a little bit. Now we're going to transition to talking about accountability as a third purpose. And so this is really more about that external, the external accountability piece of reporting out to funders, our funds being used for intended purposes, our goals and targets being met, is implementation following the approved plan, ticking all those boxes of making sure that things are happening the way they're supposed to be happening. And again, this is really more about external review and validation. And the important things here for use are transparency, validity, integrity and credibility of the system, consistency of reporting, fairness of comparisons. And as we were thinking, through accountability, a lot of examples came up, some of which are more directly linked to our kind of evaluation, but there's so many different ways that we see accountability show up in the world. And as you read the news and hear of stories, you'll probably see a lot of examples of where accountability accountability evaluation has caught or failed to catch some pretty critical things. So one of the ways that I'm engaged in accountability pretty regularly is that I work with a network of charter schools, and they a charter school authorizer that does annual and ongoing accountability for charter schools. And in the education world, accountability is a hot topic. And really, there's so much external requirements and reporting with testing and financial management and all of those things. And when I think about utilization-focused accountability, what I always try to do is, when I'm meeting with charter school leaders, is really try to connect those external measures of their performance with what is going to be internally useful to them and try to help make those connections so that it's not all a practice of just reporting out, but that there's some connection to what's going to be most useful for them to really understand their impact. And so I think the more that accountability is seen as both an internal and external process, the more that those who are responsible for the reporting can really find value in the process, the more it's likely to be used and engaged in effectively. Another example that Michael likes to share, I'll go ahead and let you talk about this one.
And the major superhighway bridge that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul and the entire east and west parts of the northern United States collapsed. Forgetting the date now, Charmaine, was it 2009?
I think it was 2008.
At rush hour. And there was a major investigation afterwards to find out why the bridge collapsed. 13 people died. It's a huge disaster for this metropolitan area. And the investigation turned up that the bridge had been inspected 9 months before it collapsed. A report was written by the bridge inspectors saying that the bridge was in danger of collapsing. There were cracks in the gullet plate to connect the vertical and horizontal parts of the bridge. And so that's an example of an evaluation not used. So part of the challenge with accountability reports is they get done as a compliance activity. The point just becomes to do the report and submit it. And that's what happened with the bridge inspection, but it didn't get put into the system in a way that got followed up on for a whole lot of reasons. When these kind of mistakes get made, there are usually multiple complex factors, as happens in hospital mistakes. When the wrong leg gets amputated or the wrong drug gets administered, it's seldom one problem. It's a system kind of problem. And that system accountability becomes a rethinking of what accountability means.
Another example is right here in Minnesota. Almost 2 years ago next week, I think, is when George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, a police officer in Minneapolis. And after that happened, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights took on an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. And they just about a month ago released their report, which is in many ways an accountability report around the extent to which the Minneapolis Police Department is meeting their requirements and following a number of human rights statutes in the state. And they identified several examples of structural racism and human rights violations. And now they're transitioning into how that accountability report will be used. And so there's, as you can imagine, a lot of politics involved in that, as well as lots of different departments trying to figure out how to enforce some of these things. So the actual report is just the beginning. And now they're getting into that use process and how to ensure that this doesn't just sit on the desk. And there are legal ramifications to it as well as procedural. So it's another example. We also talked about the residential boarding schools. Michael, do you want to talk about that?
Well, both Canada is far ahead of the United States in this, and having investigated the ways in which government supported and sponsored residential schools that took First Nations and Native American children out of their communities, refused to let them see their parents and relatives, refused to let them talk their own native languages or dress in their native dress, and was aiming to socialize and indoctrinate them into the dominant white culture. Canada's had a major review of residential schools and an apology and action on that. Just last week, the United States finally issued a report on the residential schools, including large numbers of children who were killed and died in there. Nicole Martin Rogers from here in St. Paul has just put in a web link to that report. And that's a form of accountability. The final example we'd pull up in the news, for those of you who are Americans and follow American football, Brett Favre, one of the famous all-star quarterbacks of the United States, is part of an investigation of the misuse of human services funds in the state of Mississippi, where he comes from. Millions of dollars misused. When I began evaluation, I actually was kind of negative about accountability because it seemed to be all punishing and negative, and I wanted to do formative and improvement work. But after 50 years, I've come to realize there are a lot of bad characters out there. There are a lot of people, unfortunately, who misuse funds, who do bad work, who are corrupt. And so accountability is an important part of that. And one of the stellar examples of that is the Government Accountability Office and the evaluation unit within that Eleanor Chilinsky, one of our pioneers, ran for a number of years and really established very high quality evaluation approaches to accountability. The final, the GAO office did 40 to 50 evaluations a year under Eleanor's leadership. And the work that they did really set a high bar for how accountability was an evaluation function. And those reports had major impact upon government. The final comment I'd make about accountability is with the efforts to decolonize evaluation. One of the terms we've inherited from colonial period is the term accountability. The top-down power imbalance between those authorities who were inspecting and supervising the people underneath of them and required them to do things according to the dominant culture. And so in many cases, the function of accountability, the language of that needs to be rethought to a local context that's meaningful. Sometimes that's talked about instead of in the power imbalances between those with money and power and those who are being held accountable becomes a framework of shared responsibility, that the people who provide funds and regulations have responsibilities for what they do, just as the people who are using those funds and implementing them, and that becomes a shared responsibility rather than a one-way accountability. And that part of decolonizing our language, that's one of the issues that this raises.
So switching from external accountability to internal management and oversight, this is really more about monitoring. And this is about gathering data to do ongoing monitoring of kind of just what's happening, our inputs and processes flowing smoothly, what's happening with participation rates, where are there bottlenecks occurring. So this is really about routine data to track program implementation and performance and make tweaks along the way. And this really requires timeliness, regularity, relevance, incentives to staff to really gather the data and making sure that they see the utility in it and the capacity to do that, as well as appropriate systems and links to accountability systems. So we are going to talk about what that looks like in COVID.
COVID has had huge amounts of monitoring in the health systems, trying to monitor the numbers of people who got COVID. This is a big issue right now because in the United States, we've gone to a great deal of home testing, which doesn't get reported into the overall health statistics. But trying to track how many people had COVID, how many got vaccinated, how many have symptoms of what's now being called long COVID, the inequities between the vaccinations being available in developing countries versus in the industrialized Northern European and North American countries. These are all examples of monitoring kinds of statistics and data. And the key thing I would say about use in monitoring is to, again, look at it in terms of when it's timely to act upon monitoring data. So a concrete example of how monitoring data can be used is to monitor dropouts. A common mistake that gets made with monitoring is, it's called the dosage issue. People need to participate in a program for it to have an effect. And a lot of programs at the end, the evaluator looks at the participation data and reports a dropout rate. That's absolutely useless for doing something about the dropout rate during the program. A good monitoring system is one where you're monitoring participation on a weekly basis or however often the program meets, and providing information in a timely way to be able to intervene and find out why are people dropping out early enough that you can make a difference with that. We've learned from dropouts that if you don't contact them almost immediately when they stop coming, you will lose them. But if you do contact them when they stop coming and find out what the issues are, those issues can often be solved to get people back into a program. And so being able to act upon monitoring data in a timely way and not just do it routinely again, we monitor on a 3-month basis, that's not as helpful as monitoring in real time.
So we've had some questions about both the mountain of accountability, which I had put a slide in for and then skipped because I felt like we were running out of time. I don't know if we want to tackle that, and some examples of supporting use, which is one of the principles we'll be getting to down the road. But if we want to say anything about that right now, what do you think, Michael?
Let me just say about the mountain of accountability. Let me just say about the mountain of accountability. Do you still have that slide in? Did you take it out? You can find this if you do a search for mountain of accountability, Blandin Foundation. It will take you to the full description of this. The main thing here was the opposite of what I said about decolonizing and abandoning the word accountability. What the Blandin Foundation decided to do was to embrace the term accountability for more than simply external accountability, and to treat their monitoring processes at the bottom as accountability for management, in the middle, accountability for impact, traditional program evaluation, but then to include the language of accountability for learning, development, developmental evaluation, adaptation, and strategy. So the mountain of accountability was to use that language throughout all of the different kinds of evaluation they were doing, to send a more general message about being accountable for all kinds of evaluation. And if you do a search for that, you get a full explanation of it, how it's used. It's pretty easy to find.
We'll move on to purpose 5, which is generating knowledge and lessons. And this is really about finding patterns and principles of effectiveness across programs and projects, lessons learned, and how to triangulate evaluation findings with research results. And this is about extracting principles or other lessons, and really about generating, and the data is really about insights from key informants on how to contribute to the broader field of where this program is situated. And so this is the importance of quality and comparability, a rigor of triangulation, and identifying those patterns and principles that really are going to be relevant to different contexts. So we have an example here from the McKnight Foundation. Do you like to get that one, Michael?
Yeah, the McKnight Foundation had us look at their major funding initiatives to extract lessons about the success factors involved. It was one of the first lessons learned evaluations I ever did. And it cut across a large number of their grants to focus on the importance of some of the things you've seen in the chat from Stan, for example, on the importance of relationships being strong, of engaged leadership, of really being sure that the program was focused upon the engagement of the intended beneficiaries, and generated lessons that affected the future funding that the foundation did. I'm putting in the chat the link to a YouTube I did on lessons from the Food Systems Summit last year, which led to our generating a theory of transformation, which is based upon lessons learned, knowledge generation about the nature of food transformation. It's an example of taking data from a large number, over 1,000 dialogues around the world on food systems, and putting those together into a framework about what the key success factors are for food systems transformation. So that's in chat. Another report that just came out a couple months ago is actually an excellent report by the Inspector General at the Pentagon on lessons learned in 20 years on the US involvement in Afghanistan. And it's a really hard-hitting report about wasted money, misunderstood engagements, cross-cultural disasters, top-down, arrogant, colonialist, imperialist kinds of attitudes engaged in development. That's available online. It's open, it's transparent. It's very much worth a read.
So our sixth purpose that we're going to tackle today is supporting innovation and adaptation. And this is really where developmental evaluation comes in. This is about what's being developed. This goes beyond formative evaluation to improvement, to really more about innovation, adaptation. The goal is not necessarily to arrive at a fixed model, but to continue to adapt and learn. And so the focus is more about ongoing data collection, not just that midterm and end of project. It's about pivoting as new issues emerge, flexibility, and rapid appraisal techniques. And so when I talked earlier about World Savvy, one of the things that they learned as they continued to do their work in formative evaluation was that the situation, the education system in which they're working was going to continue to adapt and change. And certainly we've seen in COVID that, you know, what used to work in education no longer is working, and didn't ever really work that well to begin with. And so they really transitioned from doing formative evaluation to doing developmental evaluation. And this model shows you the principles of developmental evaluation. Utilization-focused evaluation is the umbrella for developmental evaluation. And I'll let Michael talk more about what that has looked like.
Well, you've heard us talk in other webinars we've been doing around developmental evaluation that early in the pandemic, we said that all evaluators had become developmental evaluators because we were all having to adapt both programs and evaluations to COVID. What we're coming to understand is increasingly in the turbulent, complex, dynamic conditions of the climate emergency, the pandemic, social justice uprisings and movements worldwide, disinformation on the internet, the food systems crisis, the war in Ukraine, these things are all linked together and require much more of an adaptive mindset as the world is changing, as the crisis grows, and that developmental evaluation then is really merged in strong contrast to where we began, formative and summative evaluation, which had fixed timelines, fixed criteria, fixed reporting, and we're looking for static models that could be scaled. In a highly turbulent, complex, dynamic, ever-changing crisis environment, we need evaluation that can help people develop, innovate, adapt to changing conditions. And that means ongoing evaluation and developmental evaluation. So it's become a major purpose. And I put in chat an example of the World Food Program developmental evaluation of their COVID response. which I think is quite excellent. And that report is available publicly.
And in a couple of weeks, the folks at Social Impact have a webinar coming, and just published a blog as well about the developmental evaluations they've been doing with USAID. So there's a lot of resources around developmental evaluation and how to get involved in that if that's something that you'd like to lean into more deeply. So we wanted to return to this idea of when you think about purpose, equity and sustainability can be an explicit purpose or more of an underlying contextual thing that's paid attention no matter the purpose. And in Blue Marble evaluation, that's really the call, is that every evaluation should have a focus on equity and sustainability. And we have, many of you are part of our Blue Marble evaluation network, and we're trying to help support evaluators to do more thinking around how to embed that into evaluation. Wanted to bring that up again here as both its own purpose and an ongoing purpose across all evaluations. Do you want to say anything more about that, Michael?
No, you're good.
Okay. So I'll pass it to you for Eleanor to talk about Eleanor.
Eleanor Chalimsky, one of our great pioneers and the person who created and ran the Government Accountability Office for 14 years, died in March at the age of 95. And I did a tribute YouTube to her, which I'll put in the chat. But Eleanor was one of the key people in making these distinctions that we're talking about. And for those of you who don't know Eleanor, don't know the important role that she played as one of our great pioneers. She was one of the founders of the Evaluation Research Society that eventually became the American Evaluation Association. I urge you to have a look at that video about her life, to be inspired by somebody of her caliber who was attracted to evaluation and helped create it. And Eleanor was one of the people who formulated these distinctions early on. We were going to show you a video clip from that, but I think we won't because of the time, where she talks about how important it was in her own work at GAO to distinguish accountability from management-focused evaluations, from program judgment evaluations, and the importance of being purpose-driven. She's very eloquent about that. In that tribute I did, there's some clips of Eleanor speaking to utilization issues. She was one of the great champions of utilization. And so have a look at that YouTube video. The other thing that she talks about, and that is a big part of what we discuss in the book, in utilization-focused evaluation, is to recognize that there are tensions between these different kinds of evaluation. I see all kinds of agencies and programs that say, well, they're going to do both accountability and learning. They're going to both improve and improve. These things involve different kinds of questions. They involve different data. They involve different priorities. They involve different timelines. And so it's important not to be blasé and simply say, yeah, we're going to do both accountability and learning. We're both going to improve and prove what's working. That these are really quite different dimensions. And that's the reason why utilization-focused evaluation, with this principle of customization, says take the distinctions seriously. It's a mistake to say you're going to do everything and end up doing it all at a very shallow level. There are real choices to be made, the setting priorities. What's most important at a period of time? What do people who are the primary intended users really need to know? And is there sufficient time and resources to do the different kinds of evaluation that may come up? We have also noted now that there are a great many more kinds of evaluation than simply these 6 purposes. I just finished teaching a course at Claremont Graduate University on comparative evaluation theory. And as a result of that course, just this morning, I put together and posted a, get back to this, a video on that takes you through a more comprehensive inventory of different approaches. You want to bring up the next slide? Dave's. Yeah, so many possibilities. When I teach, I like to begin with this Dr. Seuss story. Did I ever tell you that Mrs. McCabe had 23 sons and she named them all Dave? And so when she calls out, "Yoo-hoo, come into the house, Dave," all 23 sons of her come on the run. Well, we have different kinds of evaluation because they serve different purposes. And let me tell you that in this video that I put together, there are a lot more than 23 kinds of evaluation these days. And to find out how many, you'll have to watch the video. If you go back to that last slide, Charmaine, this is the challenge of so many possible evaluation uses, but the sampler plate doing a little bit of everything is not what we're recommending. Do what you do well, do it in depth, and not make it shallow.
So just to kind of bring us back to this flow that we started with, this really is about setting the context, analyzing the situation, including attention to equity and sustainability, personalizing it, honor the personal factor, identifying and engaging those intended users, and then getting to this place of customization, engaging with them to understand that purpose. And then next month, we will talk about the fourth principle, which is to align and ensure that the design methods and analysis decisions are aligned with these three: contextualization, personalization, and customization. So we hope that you'll join us next time for that. And so we want to be sure that we give at least a little bit of time for takeaways, reactions, and questions. I saw there was one question that popped up a few minutes ago. Michael, if you want to tackle that one or open it up to others for questions, or do the Mentimeter.
Abiola Akani asked a really good question.
Sorry, Michael, I muted you instead of myself. There you go.
Abiola Akani asked a good question. It comes up regularly on these issues about, is it possible to have more than one type of evaluation conducted simultaneously, especially it comes to programs on social protection for uptake and accessing health nutrition services at health facilities and social protection. Certainly it's possible to do different kinds, but you have to think about how they affect each other and sometimes create firewalls between them. So for example, improvement-oriented evaluation really requires a sense of safety where people can talk honestly about strengths and weaknesses, acknowledge what's not working well, be honest with each other. And that often interferes with accountability evaluation, where funding's at stake and people are afraid to talk about weaknesses for fear that they'll be punished. And so the dynamics, the power dynamics of accountability and compliance can interfere with genuine reflective practice improvement-oriented evaluation. So I think it's important to have a firewall between those and to not be doing them simultaneously by the same evaluators with the same kind of data. Likewise, a summative decision about whether a program should continue as a model is quite different than ongoing development changing the model and perhaps not even having a static model because of the developmental kind of nature of it. So there are real conflicts and tensions between these kind of things. You can't really, although I hear people asking for it all the time, do good developmental evaluation and good summative evaluation at the same time. They actually involve quite different perspectives. Summative evaluation is about a generalizable, fixed, high fidelity model. Developmental evaluation is about ongoing adaptation, where the model is adaptation, not a fixed set of practices. So be thoughtful about where the tensions are between different kinds of evaluation, and don't just throw them all in and be trying to do them all with one evaluation design. There are real tensions between the types. We're going to take you out quickly to Mentimeter, where you can add in any additional questions or comments that you may have. If you go out to menti.com and enter in the code here, we only got a couple of minutes, but it will allow everybody to see all at once what. So go to menti.com and enter in the code 4008800. And you can add any thoughts, responses, takeaways, or questions. We'll do some follow-up as a part of this. But we appreciate the participation in this and the attention to the importance of intended use by intended users. And today we've been focusing on intended uses. Charmaine, if you have any final thoughts, and we'll see if people are able to get over to Mentimeter and add in some takeaways or additional responses.
I think that there's a lot of questions still about kind of who we're talking about, who those users are. And so that really does go back to last month's webinar. And so if you have more questions about that, I encourage you to watch the recording of that webinar. And I will send out a link to where you can find all of our webinar recordings with the email that will go out. The slides will go out, the recording of this will go out, as well as the Eleanor Chalimsky video. And so we'll be sure to, as long as you've signed up for this webinar, you'll be getting more information. And then I know Carmen had asked for some examples of how we're using or how we're engaging people in using the data and strategies. And I will just say that that will be coming, and we'll talk more detail about that, but I also am happy to share, I'll share a few links to that as well.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And we'll be doing the webinars every month in this year and taking on different principles. So we appreciate your engagement with this. And I urge you to look at the YouTube resources. There's a lot more depth and follow-up there. And we'll have a whole webinar on this topic of not ending with the report, but supporting the application and implementation of findings. Thank you for your feedback. We appreciate your being involved with this. Review and reflect indeed. We will be getting to alignment, and that is an ongoing issue. So thank you for anticipating that. Yeah. Internal evaluators play a huge role, and increasingly evaluation is an internal function. So we value our internal colleagues. Get one final one. And if you, to see that evolving and dynamic, look at the panorama of evaluation webinar of YouTube I just did. It's hot off the press, got finished an hour before this webinar, so you'll be the first ones to see it if you go have a look at it. And see if, before you look at it, think about how many approaches to evaluation, intended uses can you think of, and then see how many there are that we pulled together in that video. It's a lot more than 23 days, let me assure you.
All right.